How are you doing this morning? Good. I am really excited to be here. My name is Drayton Arnold, and I'm the grants manager for the City of Myrtle Beach. So I am really excited to be here. This morning we're going to talk about everything and anything grant related. So I know for me, my first day with the city was January 28, 2022, and I've been doing it for about 10 months. And finding a grant can be kind of intimidating sometimes. You don't know where to look, you don't know where to start, whether it be if you're looking for funding at the federal level, at the state level, or at the local level. Just identifying and finding grants can be difficult. So hopefully this workshop will provide you some sort of insight on how to go about finding a grant, how to go about applying for the grant, and then at the very end there, if we have time, I'll provide some recommended steps on how to properly maybe write a grant and establish a need within a grant application. So next slide. Also, if you guys have any questions for me, please feel free to interject, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. So brief introduction, who am I? As I said before, I'm the grants manager for the City of Myrtle Beach. Started January 28th. I've applied for federal grants before, so grants through the Department of Justice with our public safety and the police department, grants through FEMA and the Federal Emergency Management Association. We've gone after ARPA money before, so American Rescue Plan money before, bipartisan infrastructure law money through US DOT, so we've kind of gone after quite a bit of money before. At the state level, we've applied for grants through the South Carolina Department of Public Safety. We've applied for grants through SCPRT, through DHEC, through SCDOT, all kinds of state grants. And then at the local level, we've gone after funding through foundation funding opportunities. So your corporate foundation grants, that could be T-Mobile, we just got a grant from T-Mobile. That could be Wells Fargo, Home Depot offers grants, Lowe's offers grants, Target, we just got a grant from Target offers grants. So at the local level too, we've gotten a few grants from the Waccamaw Community Foundation as well. So I have some grant writing experience. I think in about 10 months, I've helped gotten the city right around $500,000 in grant awards. Now the city receives somewhere between $3 or $4 million a year in grants. So I report, I manage, and I close out grants on behalf of the city. So this morning we'll talk about what a grant is. I'll briefly define kind of what a grant is, just so everybody has a clear definition of what a grant actually is. We'll talk about what a solicitation is, how a solicitation should be used as essentially a guidebook for the grant application process. It's sort of the kind of go-to spot where you'll learn maybe all the details associated with the grant. So the match requirements, the allowable and unallowable expenses, the deadlines, the program requirements, that's all in a solicitation. After that, we'll talk about or kind of distinguish the difference between competitive monies and formula monies, and how organizations will usually compete over money, or they'll get a certain amount of money based on a certain formula or set of variables. After that, we'll talk about reimbursement grants. And this, for the nonprofits out there, this section or this portion will be important because reimbursement grants, you have to sort of incur the cost of incur the cost of a grant prior to getting reimbursed at a later date. So as a local government employee, we don't have to consider that, but as a nonprofit, it should be something worth considering. Next, we'll talk about where can I find a grant. I'll break that down into really two different areas. It'll be public funding. So the public funding will be your federal and your state grants. It's mostly on grants.gov, which is a grant sort of database or a grant directory. And then it'll be broken down into private funding as well, which is your local and corporate foundation funding. Next, if we have time, we'll talk about sort of 5 successful steps to grant writing. Ensure eligibility, find a grant that fills or fits a desired need, write a winning proposal, successfully report, and then close out a grant. So, everybody good? Again, if you have questions or if I'm not explaining something clear enough, please interrupt me and tell me to re-explain or ask a question. I'll do my best to answer. So what is a grant? A grant it's an award, a financial award, from one entity to another for the purpose of providing a service on behalf of the community. So it could be from a federal organization to a state organization. It could be from a state organization to a local government entity, from a federal organization to a nonprofit, et cetera. It can be any organization giving money to another organization so that receiving organization can then use those funds to provide a service on behalf of the community. Now, I think there's kind of two ways to look at it. A grant is the provision of services, but it's also the fulfilling of a need or the addressing of an issue, right? So providing an example here, let's say that I am the director of, I don't know, a nonprofit daycare here in Horry County. And over the past 5 years, I've had this daycare. Year one, had 10 to 15 kids in it. Now in year 5, I have 50 to 60 kids, right? And over the next, well, let's say 3 years, I'm expected to grow. I'm expected to grow from 50 to 60 kids to, I don't know, 70, 80 kids. And I know in order for me to sort of accommodate for the anticipated growth of my after-school program, I'm going to need grant money. So let's say a grant's out there from, let's say the state level, South Carolina Department of Education, and they're soliciting money, they're offering money for nonprofit after-school program care. My organization applies for that grant, applies for the funding from the South Carolina Department of Education. We receive the money, and we use that money to provide enhanced or expanded after-school program services within Horry County. Okay, that's the provision aspect of a grant. We're getting money to then provide services on behalf of our community, on behalf of the county. The fulfilling of a need aspect, going back to the same example here, let's say that there's education issues within Horry County. So let's say, I don't know, test scores within Horry County have gone down over the past 5 years. Let's say 5 years ago, test scores were, they averaged 78% for K through 5 kids. Now in 2022, test scores are 74. They've gotten worse over time. Let's say that absentee rates within K through 5 kids, that's worse. For some reason, kids aren't showing up to school anymore. Let's say parent-teacher engagement has also worsened, right? So there's education issues throughout the county that need to be addressed, that need to be fixed, right? And the idea of a grant is you're providing this service, you're providing money to ideally address or fix those education issues on behalf of the community, right? So it's kind of a two-pronged type deal. There's the provision of services aspect as well as the fixing or the filling of a need aspect, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. So next bullet point there. What is a solicitation? A solicitation is kind of, it's a playbook essentially, a guidebook on how to apply for grants or how to find funding. So let's say I find a grant that fills or fits the need of my organization and I don't know where to start, right? The solicitation is where to start. They're also known as a notice of funding opportunity or a notice of funding availability, so a NOFO or a NOFA. And usually with public funding sources, there's almost always a solicitation attached. So if I were to go on to grants.gov or if I were to go on to the Department of Justice's website and find a grant that fills the need of my organization, there should be a solicitation attached to that grant. And it's a document that provides sort of all the details associated with a grant. So match requirements, so deadlines. So some grants have minimum allowable amounts you can apply for. Some grants have maximum allowable amounts you can ask for. Some grants have program requirements, so where you have to sort of abide by certain steps and meet certain metrics throughout the grant award period in order to continually get reimbursed for that money. So all those details will be in a solicitation, okay? Now, with your private funding sources, at least in my experience, I haven't seen too many sort of solicitations associated with private funding, so your local and corporate foundation money. I'm sure there are some out there, but what I will say is, for example, the city recently applied for a T-Mobile grant. We recently just got this money from T-Mobile, and the solicitation or the details associated with the grant itself were on just the website of T-Mobile. They'll provide you, like I said, the deadline, the match requirement, everything you need to know about that specific grant will be on the website. So, and usually private funding is a bit more simple in that way. When you're going after public money, there's certain procurement laws you have to abide by, and usually there's metrics that you have to sort of show, hey, we're growing from year to year, from quarter to quarter, and all that will be associated with a solicitation. So is everybody clear there? Cool? Yeah? Okay, so competitive versus formula money. Competitive money, fairly self-explanatory. You're essentially competing over a pool of money, and not everybody's going to receive money, right? And some people, there have been times we've applied for grants where we receive more than what we've asked for. There have been times we applied for grants where we have received less than what we've asked for. So you're competing over a pool of money, and not everybody will receive the money they asked for, and not everybody will receive money in general. So I can provide an example here. The city recently applied for a water infrastructure grant through the General Assembly, through a state organization called the Rural Infrastructure Authority. It was ARPA money, American Rescue Plan money. And the federal government passed this money down to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly decided to give right around $900 million to this state organization called RIA. And RIA administered this money in the form of a grant program. And this grant program was to provide water, wastewater, or stormwater infrastructure project money throughout the state of South Carolina. And only local government entities and county governments were eligible to apply for this money. It was a $900 million pool of money. Now you can imagine that there are a lot of sort of water, wastewater, stormwater infrastructure needs throughout the state of South Carolina. So not everybody's going to get that $10 million, $15 million project they want. So you're competing over a pool of money. You're not guaranteed to get the money. You may get more than what you asked for. You may get less than what you asked for. And usually with competitive grants, you're scored on a certain criteria. So going back to this RIA grant, or this SKIP grant, we were scored on a competitive basis based on the ability for us to sort of establish a strong application. So priorities within the grant were things like resiliency, the ability for us to address our aging critical infrastructure, capacity of the infrastructure itself. So usually within grants they'll have, and that'll be in the solicitation as well, they'll have sort of set scoring rubrics or scoring criteria saying, hey, if you can establish this within a grant application, you'll be more likely to receive money, or it'll strengthen your grant application for you. Now formula grants are a little bit different. Formula grants are, if you apply for money, you're guaranteed to get some sort of money. You'll get, maybe it won't be the amount you ask for, the amount you want, but you'll get some sort of money. And that allocable amount will be based off of a few characteristics. Usually, going back to the city here, you'll receive money based on something like population levels or population, socioeconomic status levels, could be your geographic location, just basic demographic or geographic characteristics about where you are, where your nonprofit is, will sort of depend on the amount of money you get, and that can change from year to year, right? So providing an example here, the City of Myrtle Beach receives money on a formula basis from the Department of Justice every year. And that money we receive is based on crime levels. So let's say 1 year our crime levels are high, we're going to get more money. 1 year our crime levels are lower, we're going to get less money. It's based on a formula. We provide that information up front in the grant application. It gets put into a formula and comes out an allocable amount for our grant award, essentially. So is everybody good there? Yeah? All right. Reimbursement grants. For nonprofits out there, I think this is important to consider. I'm going to go back to, excuse me, I'll grab this from you. I'm going to go back to my nonprofit after school program example. So let's say I apply for this grant from the South Carolina Department of Education to offer these expanded services for my after school program. And I get $300,000 over a 3-year period, right? And it's a reimbursement grant, meaning I have to incur the cost up front with the anticipation of getting reimbursed at a later date. So I have to have the money in my budget to get reimbursed for that amount. So let's say January, February, March, I spend $25,000, okay? That $25,000 is coming out of my nonprofit organization's budget and is not until I submit something called an RFP or a request for payment that I will get reimbursed for that $25,000. And that can change from quarter to quarter, right? So I can submit $25,000 worth of grant expenses and that can get disapproved by the South Carolina Department of Education, and I'm not going to get reimbursed that money, right? So you have to sort of financially report and manage a grant and sort of track expenditures or expenses throughout the entirety of a grant, because all that information ultimately has to get resubmitted back to the grantor to get approved, so you can ultimately get reimbursed for the grant. And I think that's something really important to consider if you're a nonprofit wanting to apply for maybe a higher dollar grant. Usually higher dollar grants, especially public funding grants, are reimbursement grants. So you'll have to incur the cost out of your own budget first with the anticipation of getting reimbursed in, I don't know, 5 months, maybe 6 months down the line. So you're not going to get, there have been grants where we applied for money and we just got a check in the mail for the grant award. But that's fairly rare, especially with public funding. It's going to be on a reimbursement basis. So, and usually that's either monthly or quarterly. So in this example, it'd be quarterly. So every 3 months you submit an RFP. Maybe a month after that, March, you may get reimbursed for the money you spent back in January, back in February, back in March. And you'd redo it again for those 3 months, and you redo it again for those other 3 months until you got reimbursed for the entire grant award amount. So that's kind of what a reimbursement grant is. And I'd say most grants are on a reimbursement basis. It's very, I think, kind of rare to see a grant where you just simply, you apply for a grant, they say, oh, you're awarded this grant, here's a check, goodbye. I wish it worked like that, but it does not. So there's a lot of financial reporting involved and a lot of sort of record keeping, and it can get tedious at times when you're, you have personnel involved and you're applying for equipment. You have to track timesheets and pay stubs and fringe benefits and all, invoices, quotes, all these sorts of things. You have to provide that to the grantor, and then they will approve it, and then you'll get your money back. So, any questions there? No? Okay. So where to find grant funding? I'll start with state funding first. So your state grants. What I would recommend, and this is what the city uses, is these grant subscription services. And Google can be a good friend too sometimes, but we use a grant subscription service. So we pay like, I don't know, $25, $30 a month, and we use Grants Finder right here. And what Grant Finder is it's a grant database or a grant directory that sort of provides just thousands and thousands of different grant opportunities in sort of one location. And there's quite a few out there. I think on the grant booklet I've listed maybe, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10. I think they're all the same. I haven't used anything other than Grant Finder. And majority of our foundation grants that we apply for are found on Grants Finder. So I think the city pays $30 a month. And I'll show you, it's a subscription service that we have. So, I'll just use this. So here to the right is like the home page of Grant Finder, and you would use it just like you use Google. You would keyword search in what you're looking for. So if I were looking for something related to education, I type in education here. I would put my location in for South Carolina, and I would hit search, and somewhere between 3,000, 4,000 different grant opportunities would pop up on this site and would provide me with potential grant opportunities. I would then kind of scroll and look for a grant opportunity that would match my need, essentially. And going back here, these foundation grants as well can all be found on Grant Finder too, or Grants Help, Grants Watch, whichever one you decide to get. They can all be found on Grant Finder. So a grant subscription service is the sort of go-to spot for state organization funding or state level funding and your private funding, so your local foundation grants and your corporate foundation grants. I would recommend to either use somebody who has access to one of these or get one for yourself, just to be able to know where grants are and have sort of a one-stop resource to be able to find grants. And then federal money or federal grants, grants.gov is that, and that's free. Grants.gov is really the same thing as Grants Finder, it's just only for federal grant opportunities. And I'll show you kind of what the funding sources. So your public funding, you're more likely to award greater or larger award amounts. There's more money out there. Funding allocated through legislation that can be, it changes from year to year with laws being passed and with ARPA, so bill and the CARES Act money, that all changes from year to year. So kind of money and where it goes can change. So, let's say grant programs that were administered one year may not be administered another year, or it just changes from year to year. Various organizations are eligible for public funding. You can apply for funding as an individual. You can apply for funding as a nonprofit. You can apply for funding as a state organization, as a state entity. You can apply for money as a local government entity. So a lot of organizations are eligible to apply for government funding. Proposals require specific questions and data to be answered. Usually with government grants, the questions are a bit more specific. They're easier to answer. You're simply just providing data rather than having to write a narrative out, essentially. Or if you do have to write a narrative out, it's usually a bit smaller. Private funding, wide range of grants from various organizations. As I said before, you can get grants from T-Mobile, from Verizon, HTC, banks, Wells Fargo, insurance companies, State Farm. They all offer money. All of them do. So, and then the cities receive money from them. A bit more simple and straightforward than public funding as far as requirements goes. There's not a lot of tracking after you're awarded the grant, or not a lot of metrics you have to meet to show, hey, we're impacting this amount of people, or we're helping this amount of kids, or whatever it is you're applying for. Usually with private funding, it's not as stringent or strict. More adaptable to request or willing to change funding ask. So here, let's say that I get money. Let's say that I'm awarded $15,000, and for some reason I need to change what I can spend that money on after I've been awarded it. Usually with private funding, they're more willing to sort of accept that change. It's a little bit harder to do with public funding, but with private funding, it's a bit more easy. Community engagement is usually involved, so there's always a marketing and promotional aspect of private funding. I'll give an example here. So the city recently received a grant from T-Mobile where we received, I think, $12,000 to redo signs in Bathsheba Bowens Memorial Park. Kind of the signs represented the historical and cultural aspects of the park, and we're going to redo these signs to sort of help continue to educate the members and the residents of the community about the African American history of this neighborhood, right? So we got $10,000 to redo these signs. And kind of the language in the grant award agreement mandated that the city hold two marketing events throughout the entirety of this grant award period. It was a year. So actually this past October we held a marketing event where T-Mobile representatives came out. They presented a check to our mayor, to the city council members. We had community members out. PRST was out there. Neighborhood services came out. So it was a big marketing event for T-Mobile. Now we have to do one more, essentially doing the same thing to celebrate the new signs and get T-Mobile representatives out there. And it's a benefit for both, right? We get the money to replace the signs, and T-Mobile gets the marketing and the promotion aspect out of it. And I think that's a good thing about private funding. So, yeah. Cons of funding, public funding. There's a lot of administrative steps involved in public funding. And I can speak from experience here because when I first started with the city, I had to get registered in grants.gov. And then there's a federal sort of grants management software out there called Just Grants. I had to get registered with the Department of Public Safety, with SEDHEC, just all sorts of these sort of state admin sites that you have to get registered for, then approved for, and then ultimately given an account. And that took probably about 2 or 3 months for me to do. So it can be kind of a pain sometimes, especially if you're wanting to apply for a grant, let's say within a month. If you're not registered, it'll be pretty difficult to do so. So there's just a lot of admin steps involved. Changing funding initiatives / politics is involved sometimes. So, and this has happened to the city before, where we apply for recurring grants. So, there's DOJ money out there that's recurring for us, but somehow the funding is no longer there. It's been sent somewhere else. It's been given to a different organization, a different federal government entity. That's happened before, so it can be kind of good and bad. I don't want to contradict myself here because here I say solicitations are clearing resources. It depends on the grant with this slide or this point here. There are some grants out there that can be complex and that can be sort of not a pain to apply for, but just you need more than one person to be able to apply for some of these grants. And there are federal organizations out there that have been, let's say, soliciting grant money for years and years, and it's the same grant program year after year. So they have the experience, they have the resources, they have the capacity to, and the kind of the know-how to offer the same money year after year. But with some of these new grants, and as more money is coming down through American Rescue Plan Act and bipartisan infrastructure law money, a lot of new grant programs are being solicited. And a lot of these new grant programs have with them attached quite a few legislative laws and procurement laws and requirements that can be kind of hard to pick up on. So some solicitations now, there's a grant that we could go after. It's called RAISE, stands for the Rebuilding American Infrastructure Sustainably and Equitably. The solicitation is like 180 pages. So it's full of just requirements and deadlines. It's just, you need a team to apply for a grant that large. And it would take 2 to 3 years. So that's what I mean by that bullet point there. And it kind of leads me to my second bullet point. It can be intimidating at times, especially if you've never kind of gone after, let's say, federal money before, or just money in general. I remember applying for my first federal grant. It can be intimidating, especially if you're not familiar with grants.gov, if you're not familiar with, okay, I got to get registered in grants.gov first, and then grants.gov will send me an email and it'll push me to a different site called Just Grants, and then that's where I'll actually submit the grant application. For some reason, I have to get registered in a site where I'm not submitting an application at, so it can be intimidating at times because there's steps that if you haven't applied for a grant before, you just don't know. And then private funding, smaller award amounts, capacity to fully fund the project may be limited, so you can usually pull private funding together sometimes to sort of fulfill your ask. So $10,000 from this organization, $20,000 from this organization, $30,000 from this organization, that can be done. But usually, private funding amounts are somewhere between $10,000 to $15,000, at least in my experience. So, any questions for me? Yes, ma'am. Successful grant writing. Number one, ensure eligibility, ensure timeline, and ensure resources. So there have been quite a few times where, because when you find a grant, you get excited, right? You say, oh, I can apply for this grant. It fills or matches the need of my organization. I can then go ahead and move forward with kind of putting together a grant application. But if you don't read the solicitation, you could be applying for a grant that you're not even eligible for, right? So again, that's in the solicitation. There have been times where I've gotten too excited and have spent a few hours sort of drafting and researching for a grant, and then I look at the solicitation and only state governments are eligible to apply for it, meaning local governments can't apply. So that'd be number one, just to ensure you're eligible first. Ensure you have an appropriate timeline to actually apply for the funding. There have been times where you have to apply for a grant within like a week's notice. For federal grants, I would not recommend that. I would recommend at least somewhere between a month to 2 months' time to apply for some of these federal grant opportunities, especially if you're not registered in grants.gov, you're not registered with some of these organizations. You need the appropriate, or provide yourself enough ample time to be able to put together a strong application and put yourself in a position to actually receive grant money. So ensure a timeline there, and ensure resources too, right? So what happens if I'm actually awarded the grant? If I'm given $300,000 over a 3-year period to expand my after-school program services, like, do I have the capacity to do so? Is it just me? Do I need somebody to help me do these things? Do I need an accountant, somebody to financially sort of track my expenses over this 3-year period? So ensure you have the capacity or the ability to sort of track the expenses associated with a grant award if you're given the grant funding. And that kind of these 3 bullet points just kind of talk on that a bit more. Understand the solicitation, read the solicitation, review the solicitation, familiarize yourself with the terminology within the solicitation, understand what a match requirement is, understand when there's reporting deadlines coming up, understand what's allowable within a grant. So, and this point here, ensure your program fits the goals of the solicitation. Ensure that what you're asking for is allowable within the solicitation itself, because you could be asking for something or wanting something that isn't even an allowable expense within the grant, right? So though you are eligible, what you're wanting to ask for isn't an allowable expense within the grant, right? They won't provide money for it. So that goes back to just understanding and reading the solicitation. So that'd be step one there for you. Any questions there? No? Okay. Step 2, find a grant that fills a desired need or fills the desired need within your organization. So I'd ask myself these 2 questions first. What is the purpose of your organization, or why are you looking for funding? Kind of here, just put yourself in the shoes of a grant reviewer, right? If I was reading a grant application and I could clearly tell that somebody just wanted money versus somebody who actually needed money, I'm probably less likely to give them the money, right? If I know an organization needs the money, if they would be worse off, if they would go out of business, if they wouldn't be able to provide the enhanced services they would otherwise be able to provide with the money, then I'd be less likely to give them the money. It's a want versus a need. You have to establish a need within the grant application. And that would be sort of the number one thing I'd recommend. I do it in 4 ways. I'm going to briefly explain each of these 4 ways. But for me, these 4 ways will kind of distinguish or kind of separate a want versus a need within a grant application. So the first need you need to establish is something called a normative need. So if we go back to this nonprofit after-school program example, what is a normative need, Drayton? Let's say that test scores within the county have decreased. They're below a certain standard, a general consensus. So let's say the state standardized test score average is 78%, right? And test scores within Horry County is 72%. It's lower than the standard. Therefore, I need money. My organization needs money so that we can provide after-school program services to ideally bring those test scores up. That's a normative need. Establishing that your organization or the county or the area that you're looking to serve is below a certain standard. Therefore, you need money to address or fix that issue, to bring that standard up, right? That's need number 1. Express need. So express need. How do people other than yourself, other than your organization, think of the need or think of why your organization needs the money, right? So going back to I'll just use this example. How do parents think after-school program services are needed within Horry County? How do teachers? What's their opinion on grants? I get a few quotes. I put quotes in grant applications before. That's an express need. How do other people, other than your organization, feel about the money you're looking for? What's their opinion on it? Do they think it's important, right? That's an express need. Relative need. It's a comparison over time. So how has, and it can be difficult here because you don't want to make your organization look bad, but how has your services kind of decreased over time, or how has what you're trying to fix decreased over time? So you can use the same example. Test scores 5 years ago were X. Test scores now are Y. Test scores 5 years ago were 77%. Now they're 72%. My organization had 60 kids in my after-school program in 2015. Now in 2020 or 2022, we have 30 kids. We're just decreasing our services. So showing a decrease or a reduction over time will help establish that relative need. And then a perceived need. So how do you yourself or you as an organization sort of conceptualize your need? Just in your own words, why do you need the money, right? And really, these 4 ways are kind of how I've used, how I've sort of used the best ways to sort of establish need within a grant application. It helps me distinguish the want versus the need, right? If I can do these 4 things, I'm able to strengthen my application, right? Any questions for me? No? Okay. Step 3, write a winning proposal. So here I would start with goals, objectives, strategies, and SMART. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. So I would ensure that when I'm drafting a grant narrative that I've established my 4 needs, And then from there, let's say I have 3 goals. I would make sure all 3 of these goals are specific, are measurable, are attainable, are realistic and timely. I'd have 3 goals or maybe even a goal statement, and then I'd draft my application from there and essentially just use those 3 goals as a guide to write the application. Right? That would be my recommendation here. And here's kind of 3 examples of a kind of SMART goals that I have for this after-school program, and we'll kind of read through those real quick. Increase overall academic growth within students by an average of 3 points. So that's fairly specific. The audience there is students. It's measurable. I can measure 3 points. I'm not a teacher, but it could be attainable. 3 points could be done. Is it realistic? I think so. Is it timely? Can it be achieved within a semester, within a year period, or before my grant award? Sure. I think it can be all those things. And I'm kind of going through each of these things to say, when you're writing a grant application, so if we go back here, when you're writing, usually there's a project abstract and there's a project background associated with just the questions within a grant. You'll probably get these 2 questions. If you get a question or 2, you'll get these 2. Provide a project abstract and provide a program background. I would start with just creating 3 goal statements, essentially, or 3 goals of your organization that are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. I would start there first, and then think about, hey, if I were to get this money, how would I use it to get or achieve those 3 goals? And then I would answer my questions. I would answer my project abstract. I would establish a need. I would answer my program background. I would answer all the questions associated within a grant after I first establish or have a clear understanding of where I'm trying to go. Does that make sense? So that's kind of, when I say write a winning proposal, I mean establish goals and then go from there. That's all that means. Any questions for me? No? Okay. So 4 and 5, success report. So store everything. That would be my recommendation. Store everything. Because when you're awarded a grant, you're going to have to provide reporting for everything. I mean, the city recently was awarded a highway safety grant to fund 2 police officer salaries and a police vehicle. And we have to provide checks, pay stubs. The officers have to track their hours in a vehicle. We have to provide that to the Department of Public Safety. We have to provide serial numbers of everything they're wearing on their body. We have to provide VIN numbers of the vehicles they're driving. I mean, we have to provide everything. So I would store everything. That would be my recommendation there. And then 5, communicate, be transparent, and be timely with your reporting to properly, close out the grant at the end of the grant award period. So that's all I got.